Hello everyone, I am Gayatri Nimawat. On the first day of presentation of semester 3, I am going to deal with the topic Nationalism in the novel by Rabindranath Tagore, The Home and the World. This is my personal information. This is entire roadmap of my presentation. First is introduction and about author, then what is nationalism, then nationalism in Tagore, then historical background of the time of publication of the novel, then the home and the world as critic of nationalism, and then as an example, Tagore's Gora, nationalism as a civilizational universalism, then conclusion. So, first introduction. The Home and the World is a phenomenal work of Indian literature by Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. It takes a global view of the concept of nationalism and patriotism. The novel is set in Bengal during the independence era of Indian political and domestic life in the background of the Swadeshi movement. The Swadeshi movement began in 1905 and gained major force against the decision on division of Bengal. In The Home and the World, the question of the two spheres and its imbrication of the issues of women's freedom and Indian nationalism is explicitly addressed in Indian fiction for the first time. Rabindranath Tagore, the author, was born on 7th May 1861 in Calcutta, India, and died in 7th August 1941 in Calcutta. He was a Bengali poet, short story writer, song composer, playwright, essayist, and painter who introduced new prose and verse forms and the use of the colloquial languages into Bengali literature, thereby freeing it from traditional models based on classical Sanskrit. He was highly influential in introducing Indian culture to the West and vice versa, and he is generally regarded as the outstanding creative artist of early 20th century in India. In 1930, he became the first non-European to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Then, at the starting of presentation, first let understand what is nationalism. According to Gulner, nationalism is primarily a political principle which holds that the political and the national unit should be congruent. Nationalism as a sentiment or as a movement can best be defined in terms of this principle. Nationalist sentiment is the feeling of anger aroused by the violation of the principle or the feeling of satisfaction aroused by its fulfillment. A nationalist movement is one actuated by a sentiment of this kind. Nationalism is a theory of political legitimacy which requires that ethnic boundaries should not cut across political ones, and in particular, that ethnic boundaries within a given state, a contingency already formally excluded by the principle in its general formulation, should not separate the power holders from the rest. Then, according to Benedict Anderson, nation can be defined as the imagine community. In his work, he tried to give definition of nationalism, the imagine community, but he finds that it is extremely difficult to analyze the concept of nation, nationality, and nationalism. According to him, nationalism is a recent and modern creation, nations being thought of by most people as old and timeless. Nationalism is a universal in that every individual belongs to a nation, and each nation is supposedly completely distinct from every other nation. The nationalism is an idea so influential that people will die for their nations at the same time an idea difficult to define. The nationalism and Tagore. According to Tagore, in his work, he is try to define nationalism. In his work, Nationalism, he said that nationalism is the aspect of a whole people as an organized power. This organization instantly keeps up the insistence of the popular on becoming strong and efficient, but this tenuous effort after strength and efficiency drain man's energy from his higher nature, where he is self-sacrificing and creative, for thereby man's power of sacrifice is diverse from his ultimate object, which is moral, to the maintenance of this organization which is mechanical. And he also tried to define nationalism in India, that nationalism is a great menace. It is the particular thing which for years has been at the bottom of India's troubles. And in as much as we have been ruled and dominated by a nation that is strictly political in its attitude, we have tried to develop within ourselves, despite our inheritance from the past, a belief in our eventual political destiny. So through this we understand that Tagore's point of view toward nationalism is not that much good as Gandhiji or other nationalists. Tagore took the view that since nationalism emerged in the post religious laboratory of industrial capitalism, it was only an organization of politics and commerce that bring harvest of wealth or carnivals of materialism by spreading tentacles of greed, selfishness, power, and prosperity, for turning up the baser instinct of mankind and sacrificing in the process the moral man, the complete man, to make room for for the political and commercial man, the man of limited purpose. Nationalism, according to Tagore, is not a spontaneous self expression of man as social being, where human relations are naturally regulated so that a man can develop ideals of life in cooperation with one another, but rather a political and commercial union of a group of people in which they congregate to maximize their profit, progress, and power. It is the organized self interest of a people where it is least human and least spiritual. Tagore deemed nationalism a recurrent threat to humanity because with his propensity for the material and the rational, it trampled over the human spirit and human emotion. It upset man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. Tagore also found the fetish of nationalism a source of war, hatred, and mutual suspicion between nations. In The Home and the World, through the character of Nikhil, Tagore alter ego in the novel, who is patriotic but wouldn't place nation above truth and conscience, says. And he says, I am willing to serve my country, but my worship I reserve for right, which is far greater than country. To worship my country as a god is to bring curse upon it. This is the point of view of Nikhil, Tagore through Nikhil. However, Nikhil's friend Sandeep, a charismatic but unconscionable nationalist to whom any action in the name of the nation is right, no matter how far it may be from truth or justice, explained country's need must made into a good, and one must set aside conscience by putting the country in its place. Tagore saw this radical view of Sandeep, in which the nation is apotheosis and placed above truth and conscience, as a recipe for disaster. It breeds exclusivism and dogmatism through the Hegelian dichotomous logic of self fundamental hostility toward the others. Thus, every nation becomes narcissistic and consider the presence of another a threat to itself, waging war against other nation for its self fulfillment, and self aggrandizement becomes a justifiable and even holy act. Tagore was opposed to the idea of the nation. He was even more fiercely opposed to India joining the bandwagon of nationalism. This would compromise India's history and identity as a culture and bring it under the shadow of the West. He warned, we in India must make up our minds that we cannot borrow other people's history, and that if we stifle our own, we are committed suicide. When you borrow things that do not belong to your life, they only serve to crash your life. I believe that it does India no good to compete with Western civilization in its own field. India is no beggar of the West. Then for to know the nationalism in The Home and the World, we have to understand the historical background of the time of publication of the novel The Home and the World. The Home and the World is set in the year 1905. During this time, Lord Curzon, the viceroy of Bengal, divided Bengal presidency into two parts, eastern and western. This decision was in accordance with the British colonial policy of divide and rule. The decision resulted in widespread protests, culminating in the Swadeshi movement. Initially, Tagore was an enthusiastic supporter and advocate of the movement, but with the passage of time, as the movement spread, Tagore gradually started to get more and more frustrated and disillusioned with it. By this time, the movement began to indulge in valorize violence. Communal riots between Hindu and Muslim took place in 1906 and 1907. The Swadeshi movement between Hindu and Muslim is important in this background for the background of this novel. Then all this pain and distress Tagore to movement as far as possible. He wrote The Home and the World as a critic of nationalism in general and the Swadeshi movement in its pitfall in particular. Then The Home and the World as critic of nationalism. Initially, the novel seems to explore the forces of modernism. At the starting, we can see the force of modernism, but the novel's sharp criticism of the nationalistic politics in general and the Swadeshi movement in particular never misses the eye. Like Nikhil, Tagore too tried to promote some indigenous Swadeshi habits and enterprises long ago but failed. It must be taken in mind in this context that Tagore was completely against the moderate Congress way of mendicancy. The Home and the World was Tagore's critic of extremist nationalism in the sense it's a fetishing of the nation and the subordination of morality to its worship of nation. While Sandeep representing Swadeshi nationalist has a dual character in his masculinity. He has a hard, aggressive conception of masculinity which he exploits to draw other men and women. In one hand, he worships Bimla as an embodiment of motherland, and on the other, he treats her as an object of eroticized patriotic adoration. Nikhil, on the contrary, represents the ideal of zamindari paternalism to which Tagore himself subscribed. His very presence allows for a deep critique of Swadeshi extremist nationalism based on fetishization of the nation. Tagore also criticized the ruthless instrumentalism of everything in the name of the nation. In The Home and the World, Sandeep's story begin this way: that the important man says, "The that which has come to my share in mine, and the weak man assent. But the lesson of the whole world is that is really mine, which I can snatch away. My country does not become mine simply because it is the country of my birth. It becomes mine on the day when I am able to win it by force." Tagore here not only critiquing the extremist form of Indian nationalism but also hinted at Sandeep's villainy at the very outset. In one place, Nikhil burst out against the British atrocities in India as well as the atrocities perpetrated by the Indian nationalist terrorists. It was Buddha who conquered the world, not Alexander. This is untruth. When stated in dry prose, oh, when shall we be able to sing it? When shall all these most intimate truths of the universe overflow the pages of painted books and leap out in a sacred stream like the Gangas from the Gangotri? Nikhil and Sandeep here represent two opposing vision for the nation. Bimla allegorically again representing the country. It torn between the two. She does not know what would be the right guiding principle for her. Nikhil's vision is to vision of enlightened humanitarian. It is based on a true equality and harmony of individual and nation. On the contrary, Sandeep's vision is the vision of radical, narrow minded, and aggressive nationalists. This vision creates a powerful sense of patriotism in individual. It threatens to replace their moral sensibility with national prejudice and blind fanaticism. Then Nikhil pronounced a universal feeling similar to that of Tagore himself throughout the novel. This results in a one-to-one argument that he has with Sandeep. Sandeep randomly equates God with nation, while Nikhil proves how it is imperative to bring together the entire human community to find God. and how the cult of nationalism through a development of national egoism and bigotry only spoil that purpose. Through this dialogue between Sandeep and Nikhil, we can see the nationalism and two contrary view. Sandeep says, I truly believe my country to be my God. I worship humanity. God manifests himself in man and in his country. Then Nikhil says, if that is what you really believe, there should be no difference for you between man and man, and so between country and country. Then Sandeep says, quite true, but my powers are limited, so my worship of humanity is continued in the worship of my country. Nikhil says, I have nothing against your worship as such, but how is it you propose to conduct your worship of God by hating other countries in which he is equally manifest? Nikhil loves his country as much as, if not more than Sandeep, but he won't allow his love for the country to go beyond his conscious. He says, I am willing to serve my country, but my worship I reserve for right, which is far greater than my country. To worship my country as God is to bring curse upon it. On the other hand, Sandeep believes that one ought to say aside conscious by putting the country in its place. According to Tagore, this radical view of Sandeep will apotheosis the nation and place it away from the truth and conscious, and this certainly would head for a disaster. This thoughtless adoration of the nation and his belief that any action, however atrocious or unprincipled, is permissible if done for the sake of the nation, ultimately turn him into the fearsome, fanatic, and dreadful criminal. Unhesitatingly, he uses conspiracy or brutality to achieve his objective. Then, as an example, we can see the Tagore's novel Gora. Here, we can find nationalism as civilizational universalism. Gora is widely considered one of the most important novel even written in British India, for it is an allegory of Indian nationalism, representing largely Tagore's own view of it, whereby religious division is replaced by worship of Indians' natural and cultural diversity. A novel steeped in the colonial experiences which highlights the resultant crisis of personal identity. Gora brings out this crisis of identity as a result of East West encounter. In Gora, Tagore dwells on the civilization aspect of nationalism, one that is needed in a multicultural, multi ethnic, and multi religious country like India. The India of Bharatvarsh, the idea of Bharatvarsh is a key concept in Gora. It is not merely a geographical area, it is identified with faith, religion, tradition, customs, and the indigenous values of subcontinent. At the end of the novel, Gora asks to be taught the mantra of that deity who belongs to all Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Brahmo, the doors of whose temple are never closed to any person of any caste or race, the deity not only of the Hindus but of Bharatvarsh. The novel is not just a search for self identity but for secularism that is inclusive and indigenous at the same time. Gora's movement from a Hindu militant to inclusiveness echoes Tagore's critique of militant Swadeshi Hindutva and nationalism. Gora is a call to form yourself into a nation and resist this encroachment of the nation. To conclusion, we can say that post-colonial critics like Ernest Gellner and Benedict Anderson have shown how nationalism results into the sentiments of illogicality, bigotry, and hatred in people. Leela Gandhi has spoken of its byproduct, racial discrimination and hatred, and the eagerness with which citizens are ready to both kill and die for it. Fanon, even before that, has elaborated that although the global of nationalism is to create a horizontal relationship and fraternity within its people, in reality, the nation never speak of the hopes and aspiration of the entire image community, and hierarchy, factional hegemony, disparately, and exploitation remain a common feature in its. In the novel The Home and the World in Sandeep's action, Tagore has anticipated all these drawbacks of nationalism mentioned by later literary cultural critics. So these are work citation. Thank you.